Quakers and the Indian Removal of the Cherokee by Jenny Kirby, Liberty University, History 530, American Christian Heritage, Dr. Sada. Who are the Quakers? The Quakers was a Christian group who formed in Pennsylvania by William Penn, and they believed in total salvation through meditation to access the Holy Spirit. And through that meditation, they would be saved. They promoted peace, justice, and they formed missionaries to teach education, Christianity, and white culture to the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokee tribe was one of the civilized tribes in the southern parts of the United States. They held a newspaper. They lived in log cabins. They promoted agriculture. And most importantly, they did not partake in their normal traditional ways as nomads. They pretty much stayed in their colonies. But by the 1800s, Georgia felt that they should have their lands, and hence the Indian removals began. When that happened, the federal government began to really take heed in what Georgia was having to say. So they allowed Georgia to remove their rights as human beings, and they began to just take their lands right from under them. When that happened, the Quakers formed a small civil rights movement through writings explaining to the federal government that these Indians were civilized, that they embraced Christianity, and that they were going to become exactly what the federal government wanted them to be, to integrate into white society. And the Quakers did their best to prove to the federal government that this is exactly what was happening. However, the removals their rights were continuing to be stripped from them, and they slowly began to see that the federal government wasn't listening. In response to the Quakers' movement into this crusade, Catherine Beecher and several other Americans began to really see the horrors of the Indian removals. They began to understand that Indians they were human beings, and that they had feelings, and that they were really trying to integrate into white society, and therefore they felt that the Indians deserved a chance. They began to really protest against the federal government and the Indian removals. The Jackson administration ignored all of their efforts and initialized the Indian Removal Acts anyway. When they did that in the month of November, they began to remove the Indians off their lands. And they used the excuse that the Indians their lands were being taken over by whites, and that they didn't have any really place to go, and that for their protection and for their own good, they were to journey to the Oklahoma Territory. That way they could keep their culture, to keep their belief system. So they really made the Indian removals seem more Christian, and to slowly do away with the fact of that they were being very brutal with it, to please the Quakers and Harriet Beecher and others, saying, hey, this is a really great thing for them. This would really help them to gain their independence. In conclusion, when he removed the Indians from their lands, several Indians were exposed to weather environments, starvation, disease, and began to die along the trail. Thousands of them died. But the most important thing about this movement was the Quakers did demand that their human rights to be respected. That they did start a civil rights movement that got the Beechers involved. They demanded that the federal government acknowledge the Indians as human beings, their rights to hold their own lands. They did promote peace, and they begged for the federal government not to do these things. All efforts failed. The Cherokees were forced off their lands. The federal government pretty much ignored all their efforts, and they journeyed to Oklahoma, where thousands perished and died.